Great. Well, welcome back to the second session, which has the same title as the first, so hopefully it won't just be repetitive. Inspired by the opening comments, looked up this Twitter character called Kim Kierkegaardian, and she, among her tweets, my favorite is after her boyfriend Kanye West. She's written one that goes, "Oh, Kanye won 3 Grammys. That makes a total of 21. So proud. But it avails nothing, being only a higher and more glittering illusion." So there you go. This stuff works. So I've also, as I was tweeting about the first session, Andrew Sentence, the British economist, said, "I thought that Kierkegaard was in the Monty Python Philosopher's Song, but it turns out he wasn't." So I initiated a little contest to come up with a lyric that would follow something like, Immanuel Kant was a real pissant who was very rarely stable. Heidegger was a boozy beggar who could think you under the table. And the best I could come up with was Kierkegaard liked his liquor hard. But, so we'll see if anyone can beat that. We'll see what Twitter comes up with. But it does turn out that although Monty Python didn't put Kierkegaard in the Philosopher's Song, they did do a spoof of some East End of London gangsters from the 1960s called the Piranha Brothers, who at one point had a man with them who was called Kierkegaard, who simply sat there biting the head off whippets, which may well you will of that. Anyway, I also, minded by the conversation about agents and whether studying economics was good for you or bad for you, did a little search, and it turns out that there's a whole literature on whether studying economics makes you a worse and more selfish person. And it turns out that economists free ride more than anyone else. They are also they actually less cooperative than anyone else, and in fact they are more corrupt than anyone else. When a study of fairness was undertaken, it turned out that everyone else had a fairly common definition of fairness, whereas the economists seemed to have no understanding of it whatsoever and struggled to even define it. Anyway, in this session, I'm hoping that we will learn a lot. We have 2 very good speakers, Abby Kluchin, who is a lecturer at Columbia University and an adjunct member of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Among other things, she's a voracious reader of Victorian novels and science fiction, and her writing includes On the Body, Dreams and Hysteria, an introduction to Freud, Spinoza and Mendelssohn. I may have garbled several books into one. Yeah. Oh, are they? Okay. And then Amar Bhide is a Thomas Schmidt-Heine Professor of International Business at Tufts University. His most recent book is A Call for Judgment, Sensible Finance for a Dynamic Economy. He's an old friend of mine, and I was just reading about Kierkegaard before this session. I found this great quote that I thought explained why Amar is a speaker. This was, his contemporaries saw him as a troublesome, quarrelsome figure. He was a familiar sight, strolling about the old city where he created the illusion that he was merely an underemployed gentleman. I think this is the perfect description of this man. Anyway, I hope the issues that we'll get into, I was very struck by thinking about this whole notion of choices and how it's affecting economics today, and Kahneman I've talked to, and the whole notion of this sort of fast mind and slow mind and how you contract between the fast and the slow parts of your brain. I wonder what, in terms of making choices, Kierkegaard would have had to say about that. Gary Becker is another Nobel laureate like Ned Phelps, and I've talked to him about his notions of, how do you contract the current self, reaching rational contracts with the future self, and he has a theory explaining suicide bombing in terms of a religious fundamentalism where you commit to, where the weight that you give to the future joy that you will, I guess the virgins and all that, in heaven, affects your current behavior now. So I'd be intrigued to see if we're going to get into that question. Amar has written a lot about entrepreneurship. I wonder, I mean, Keynes's notion of animal spirits, it seems to me, is about something taking hold of you that is beyond a rational choice. I'd be interested to know what you would make of that in the context of Kierkegaard. And I'm also struck by Greenspan, the Fed. There's this quote that Kierkegaard has about, I'm so misunderstood that people don't even understand me when I'm saying I'm misunderstood. Greenspan always used to say, if you think you've understood me, you've misheard me, which was probably the right approach for a central banker. And I'm intrigued, as Amar writes a lot about central bankers, to know if Kierkegaard was appointed to run the Fed, what he would make of it. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Abby to kick us off and give Amar a few minutes to think about some answers to those questions.
Well, thank you for all of those notes on economists. I guess it's a good day to be a philosopher instead. So I was paging through some snippets from Kierkegaard, some of the later bits of Kierkegaard's journals recently, and I came across a passage that seemed quite apropos for thinking about Kierkegaard on the 200th anniversary of his birth, about how he has been read, about how we read him now, and specifically, as we're discussing him today, around this cluster of ideas of the individual, of capital, of media, anxiety, choice, and so forth. So he writes about what he will leave behind and to whom, and I quote, "In one of the Psalms, it is said of the rich man that he heaps up treasures with great toil and knoweth not who should inherit them. So I shall leave behind me, intellectually speaking, a capital by no means insignificant. And alas, I know full well who will be my heir. It is that figure so exceedingly distasteful to me. He that till now has inherited all that is best and will continue to do so, the docent, the professor. Yet this is also a necessary part of my suffering. To know this and then go calmly on with my endeavor, which brings me toil and trouble, and the profit of which, in one sense, the professor will inherit. In one sense, for in another sense, I take it with me. And even if the professor should chance to read this, it will not give him pause, will not cause his conscience to smite him. No, this too will be made the subject of a lecture. And again, this observation, if the professor should chance to read it, will not give him pause. No, this too will be made the subject of a lecture." Close quote. Since Kierkegaard hated the figure of the academic, that literally the nastiest thing he could call anyone was assistant professor, I thought I would opt not to make this observation the subject of a lecture, but instead to use it to talk instead about a rather unexpected heir to Kierkegaard's intellectual capital, an alternative to the professor, if you will, and this is a figure that the consul alluded to earlier, which is, of course, as those of you who pay attention to Twitter know, Kim Kierkegaardashian. Now, I don't know whether Kierkegaard would have loved Twitter, but Twitter loves Kierkegaard, which is appropriate because Kierkegaard would have been fantastic at Twitter. And I've given this probably too much thought, which 19th century philosophers would have been good at Twitter. Kierkegaard is right up there. Nietzsche would have been good at Twitter. Schlegel would have won at Twitter. I sometimes get a little bit genuinely sad that Schlegel never lived to see Twitter. But Kierkegaard, too, with his crumbs, his aphorisms, his fragments, and especially with his love for inhabiting multiple pseudonymous identities, I think he would have felt quite at home there. So plenty of dead philosophers have Twitter accounts in their names. There's usually multiple ones in multiple languages. But none of them, according to my not terribly scientific investigation of this phenomenon, have anything close to the following that Kim Kierkegaardashian enjoys, which as of yesterday was just under 100,000 followers. I count myself among them. 100,000 followers. 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 100 The self-description of it is as follows: the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard mashed with the tweets and observations of Kim Kardashian. Kind of amusingly, the parts from Kierkegaard are real, whereas the parts from Kim Kardashian are made up. I'm not sure what that's about. Kim Kardashian is, of course, a person who is famous for being a person who is famous, the star of multiple reality shows, socialite, clothing designer. She has made herself into not only a brand, but an industry, very successfully. And there have been other attempts to mash up philosophers with pop stars on Twitter. I'm not making this up. Justin Bieber, Martin Buber. But none of them have really taken off like Kim Kierkegaardashian. Kim Kierkegaardashian has cornered the Kierkegaard market on Twitter. And I think Twitter is actually a fitting platform for this version of Kierkegaard because since, like many Twitter feeds, it's time-stamped and date-stamped, it reads like a series of journal entries. So if you'll permit me, I want to give you just a brief taste of this updating of Kierkegaard's journals. Unlike a traditional journal, which goes from earlier to later, I'm going to proceed in the way that you would actually encounter a Twitter feed, beginning with the most recent, and you're welcome. I've cherry-picked from hundreds of these entries. So, March 25th, 2013. I never thought I would ever say this, but I'm wearing flats today. I have lost my footing temporarily, but I hope I have not lost myself. March 20th. With spring around the corner, I've been playing with more cream and white instead of just all black. But beneath it lies despair, just the same. January 18th. Worldly anxiety always leads us toward petty restlessness and away from the sublime calm of simple things. That's why I love a nude lip. December 24th, 2012. Tanning lotion also makes a great gift. It gives an outward glow so convincing that no one will suspect that you are in despair. October 7th. Every revelation you make is an illusion. So far, no one has succeeded in knowing you. Your white pumps literally go with any outfit. October 2nd, this is my favorite, Alea Marquesa Balenciaga, I find pleasure in speaking a foreign language in order to become estranged from myself. October 1st, up early, mani-pedi time, still half asleep. Of all ridiculous things, it seems to me the most ridiculous is to be busy. August 4th, God grant me peace from my foolish earthly devices, my wild longings, the anxious hungers of my heart. I'm craving froyo so badly. I'm almost done with this part. August 1st, what our age lacks is not reflection but passion, and so my leather legging addiction continues. July 22nd, hair braids, bright colored nails, and watermelon. Let others complain that the age is wicked. My complaint is that it is paltry. I know that unpacking jokes actually makes them unfunny, but indulge me, because I think that Kim Kierkegaardashian is actually much subtler than it thinks it is, as well as a bizarrely appropriate homage to Kierkegaard. The conceit, of course, seems quite simple. It's the juxtaposition of the highbrow with the lowbrow, depth with shallowness, philosophy with fashion, the interior versus the exterior. And we could leave it at that and move on, as everybody else but me today, no doubt, will do. But we could linger with it a little longer and notice a few things. First, and perhaps most obviously, that Kim Kierkegaardashian actually reproduces and displays quite elegantly the association in Kierkegaard's thought between the aesthetic and the feminine. There are choices and there are choices for Kierkegaard, and there are also those who choose and those who are chosen, those who exist to be chosen. It's how the knight gains the princess that is at issue for Kierkegaard. It is not how the princess gains herself. And wherever one remains only in the aesthetic rather than in the realm of the ethical or the religious, for Kierkegaard you will find a woman, whether it is the nameless young girl in Fear and Trembling, whose unshakable conviction in the face of every difficulty that her desire will be fulfilled is revealed to be a simple passion of the heart rather than the faith of an Abraham. for no clear reason other than the fact that she is young and a girl and naive, and as such it seems cannot look existence in the face. Or whether it is as the desired object, or really I should say the prey of Johannes the Seducer in Either Or, who goes into raptures on female loveliness as the subject par excellence of any self-respecting aesthete. For as he says, woman is the dream of man. So in this way, this Twitter account is a sly and quite clever jab at Kierkegaard, a commentary on who really has the possibility for choice within his system. System is the wrong word, Mark is about to tell me that. Who really has the possibility for choice, who can become an individual. It's actually quite reminiscent of the way that Kierkegaard's fellow existentialist Simone de Beauvoir takes aim at him in The Second Sex, when she's trying to determine how one can achieve transcendence, which is to say how one can choose decisively and project oneself into the world as an individual, how one can do that when one is also a woman. And she suggests that Kierkegaard actually forecloses on this possibility. But even as Kim Kierkegaardashian reproduces Kierkegaard's gender politics, it also serves, by way of the medium in which it is embedded, as a way to think about the formation of the individual through his or her choices. And as someone who was eternally concerned with his age and with his generation, I like to think that he would have paid careful attention to social media and to Twitter, since on the one hand, it functions as the apotheosis of the single individual, insofar as it allows for the total and continual self-display and self-promotion of that individual, such that every choice, every action, no matter how tedious, can be made visible, possibly with an attached picture if you so desire, as soon as one leaps into the electronic void and presses the little blue tweet button. It makes possible the constant performance of the self through choices to constantly broadcast one's choices. But then, of course, there is no single individual as the single individual in relation to the absolute in this context. Without an audience here, the individual is lost. And yet, I bet that Kierkegaard would have found some productive possibilities here, too, because just like whoever is behind Kim Kierkegaardashian, you can also use Twitter in total anonymity. You can become anyone you like. And Kierkegaard, as we know, wore many masks. He used many pseudonyms to inhabit and to speak from different positions. I checked, they do not have their own Twitter accounts. But he was, yet, that can be on you. But he was a master of hiding, of indirect communication, as Wayne was telling us earlier, of creating multiple personae. This is the man who invented the idea of showing up at the theater for 10 minutes just so that he could show that he was present, and then running home and writing frantically. And he's also the one who tells us that the Knight of Faith might look exactly like a tax collector, that he will be indistinguishable from any bourgeois Philistine. And here again, I see Kim Kierkegaardashian as legitimate homage. It's doubly pseudonymous, after all. Actually, it was pointed out to me by a scholar of late antiquity that it's technically doubly pseudo-epigraphical. But the individual or the group, we don't know, that's behind it actually recedes entirely from view. But what I think the Kim Kierkegaardashian Twitter phenomenon reveals most importantly, if you overthink it to the extent that I am doing today, is how very difficult it is to identify when one is genuinely making a choice. And how frequently we mistakenly believe that we are choosing, that we are forming ourselves, when in fact we're merely play-acting at choice, merely masquerading. Just imagine, for instance, what Kierkegaard would have thought of the idea of fashion as unmediated self-expression. You don't actually have to imagine it. I'm going to tell you it's from the sickness unto death. And as you might imagine from the context, it is one of the many symptoms of despair. Quote, "The man of immediacy does not know himself. He quite literally identifies himself only by the clothes he wears. He identifies having a self by externalities. There's hardly a more ludicrous mistake, for a self is indeed infinitely distinct from an externality. I want to read you one more passage from The Sickness Unto Death. It's the passage that's the precursor to Heidegger's Das Man in Being and Time. And here Kierkegaard is warning of the many forms that despair can take, including the type that, quote, seems to permit itself to be tricked out of itself by the others. Surrounded by hordes of men, absorbed in all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the ways of the world. Such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too hazardous to be himself, and far easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, a mass man, unquote. And what's more, Kierkegaard knows full well that this form of despair can have extremely felicitous external effects, that it can work in our favor in quite material and quite appealing, even seductive ways. He continues, quote, now this form of despair goes practically unnoticed in the world. Just by losing himself this way, such a man has gained an increasing capacity for going along superbly in business and in social life. Indeed, for making a great success in the world. As is natural, the world generally has no understanding of what is truly appalling. The despair that not only does not cause one any inconvenience in life, but makes life cozy and comfortable is in no way, of course, regarded as despair, close quote. Now, as you may already have surmised, there are plenty of aspects of Kierkegaard's thought that I'm not going to hop on board with, including the rigid distinction between the internal and the external, the idea that the self has nothing to do with the performance of the self aesthetically, or, as I noted before, the persistent association of the feminine and the aesthetic. And yet, despite some of these reservations, I have no hesitation in saying that I think we need Kierkegaard today to remind us to find strangeness and unfamiliarity and horror in a whole host of places that seem comfortable and soothing and safe. We need him to insist that there are moments that truly are moments of crisis, moments that encompass the fullness of time, that some choices are genuinely irrevocable, and to remind us, generally speaking, to be appalled rather than complacent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And it does strike me there's this fascinating phenomena with Twitter at the moment where people are actually identifying themselves as real and then fake is the parody. And now some friends of mine are getting both the real and fake. I feel Kierkegaard certainly would have been both real Kierkegaard and fake Kierkegaard. At least 10 or 20, yeah, absolutely. Anyway, a man who has no Twitter accounts, I think. Amar Bhide, Amar, over to you.
So, after this bravura performance, Matthew, could we just possibly break for lunch? Or maybe I could do this pseudonymously, you know, sort of like, they have these, they interview gangsters on television behind a screen and voice change, so nobody would attribute. So as some of you who've been to these center conferences know, we address big issues for individuals, for economics, for societies. I'm unfortunately a narrow sort of chap. I know a little bit about entrepreneurship. I know something about finance. I did take the statutory one humanities course every term that an engineering student had to take. And I did read some Will Durant, but nobody is really going to confuse me with a big cosmic thinker. I've been happy to be at these conferences, but I've in the manner of a privileged poseur, happy to be included, but afraid like hell that I'd be found out. At least when the conversation wasn't about entrepreneurship or finance. So when Richard asked me to speak at this conference, I said, this is not a leap of faith, this is a certain plunge into the abyss of a public unmasking and humiliation. But then, as you may have seen, Richard is a good salesperson, and he sort of led me to think that this might not be so bad after all. I mean, what I knew about Kierkegaard at the point you could write on the head of a small pin, I figured I could expand that as preparation to what you could write on a thumbtack. You know, that would be like 100 or 1,000-fold improvement of where I stood from. Then I figured, how bad could this be? You know, sort of my modest reading, I might completely misunderstand what he wrote. But then as Matthew pointed out, everybody misunderstands Kierkegaard. Why should I be any different? Or it could be that, it could be at the end of it, you guys would scratch your heads and say, what has that got to do with Kierkegaard and the topic? And I'd say, I'm in Kierkegaard's company, nobody understood me. Finally, I figured that I could sort of mitigate the risk, minimize the risk of being unmasked by being Kierkegaard-like, which is I would tell stories, I would be elliptical, I would speak, my thoughts would jump around, and I'd be opaque. So, you know, and then throw in a little bit of sort of a tendency to mutter, a sporadic stutter, an exotic subcontinental accent, and I could be home and dry in about 20 minutes. So, as I said, I'd start with the story, and the story of a personal crisis. Well, actually, it's not much of a crisis. I mean, it's not Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son or anything. But on the other hand, Kierkegaard made much hay of breaking a fairly short engagement. So, you know, so if my crisis is not a big deal. But my story starts anyhow in 1977 when I arrived at Harvard Business School with these two gentlemen who are sitting here. So please don't contradict what I say. And they had the good sense to leave. I stayed in one capacity or the other for the next 23 years. Even when I arrived in 77, HBS was plush, not a leaf out of place, and everything else. Across the river, it is a little seedier, but boy, did they make up for it in self-assurance. I mean, we were tradespeople, bricklayers, carpenters. On the other side they were scholars. They were part of the community of scholars. And so we always had a bit of an inferiority complex. And there were many differences, but I want to point to two in particular, which are germane to the story. One is on our side of the river, if I may say so, although Maury was on both sides. So, on the business school side of the river, there's an obsession with facts, the specific facts of the case. And there was a deep interest in history at two levels. History in terms of, to a moderate degree, informing what had happened by way of precedent, but history of the very specific situation. Go over to the other side of the river, there's, shall we say, the most modest interest in concrete facts. If there was any interest in facts, these were abstracted facts as might appear in data pulled off a database, but actual concrete facts, that was not of interest. And I mean, as a little aside, the good, great, late Alfred Chandler, who was usually an unflappable gentleman, but if you really wanted to get a rise out of him, you had to ask him what he thought of Oliver Williamson, and he would go up in flames and in anger because he thought that Oliver Williamson had taken his really rich story and condensed it into this rather dubious, highly abstracted model, for which he eventually won the Nobel Prize, of course. But that's a different story. The other big difference was there's a relentless. I mean, so it was not just facts at the business school. There was what Frederick Ruttlesberger called a little bit of a theory. He called it a walking stick, so sort of to help you navigate the facts, but nothing more than a walking stick. The other big difference had to do with responsibility and decisions. The business school had taken the case method from the law school and really pushed it way beyond. So at the law school, the case method was used to illustrate points. The business school used it to force day in and day out, the idea that you were responsible for making a specific decision at a particular point in time, knowing that you could be wrong and that there were always two sides two sides to the question, and that this was a difficult process, but it was an unavoidable process, and if you were chosen, as it were, this was your responsibility for making specific decisions. On the other side of the river, going hand in hand with this notion of theory rather than concrete facts, were basically no decisions. Economics department, sort of case in point, but possibly not only. There were no more decisions being made in these theories as no more than, say, two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom deciding to become water. It was preordained. I mean, that's what water was. So everything in those theories was a previous endowment and interests, which are also part of some of these endowments. And what was studied and what was taught was not how to make a decision in the light of specific in the light of specific facts, but how to predict what would happen. I mean, what would happen if you mixed hydrogen and oxygen and lit a match, where nobody was making any decisions per se. Now, I was kind of trapped between these two worlds. And on the one side, I was studying entrepreneurship. I was studying hundreds of entrepreneurs, and each had its own story, and you could not understand that story without reference to the specific facts of the specific entrepreneur. Illusory or not, the entrepreneurs believed that they were making difficult decisions. At some point, I went around and interviewed about 50 or 60 entrepreneurs on the question of, does honesty pay? And my conclusion at the end of these conversations was, no, not really. Because the notion that there is a reliable punishment, as in standard economics models of sort of a prisoner's dilemma game, and there's reputation. No, it really doesn't work that way. Furthermore, it is not even clear what the right thing to do is if you want to do the right thing. So is it, should you lie to your supplier and say the check's in the mail? In a Kantian sense, of course, you shouldn't lie. But if you did not lie, the guy or gal might not supply you more goods. If more goods were not supplied, everybody else who was dependent on you would go down the tubes. Maybe he or she would be worse off if you told him or her the truth, that the check was not in the mail. And so this was a troublesome, difficult space that I was confronting on a regular basis. I had been given my simple walking stick, as Roethlisberger might put it, by a wise old dean who sent me a copy of Risk, Uncertainty, Profit by Frank Knight. I'd never heard of the man before, and I read it and I said, my God, this speaks exactly to my interests and concerns. I mean, many of you know what it is, but just very briefly, Knight argued that there are three kinds of the three kinds of risks, roughly, or uncertainties. There's the mathematical risk of tossing coins or rolling dice, where you could mathematically calculate what the odds of different things were. There are statistical probabilities where you could tabulate like events, and then you could get a distribution. And he said there was a third kind of uncertainty, which is true uncertainty, where the future was really different from the past. These were one-offs. There were no instances that you could gather to gather distributions. And I said, that's what my guys are dealing with on a regular basis, day in and day out. On the other side of the river, I craved, I have to admit, them sort of, I was insecure. These people were smarter than I was, way smarter than I was. They were scholars, I was a tradesman. And I wanted them to like me, to think I was sort of like at least half as smart as they were. But it is, I mean, this is going to be politically incorrect, but it is almost like being a Korean graduate student at a conference where he kind of knows the language being spoken, but he doesn't fully understand what is being said. And when he says something, sure as hell nobody else understands what he's saying. So it was, I kind of knew what these people were saying. I'd taken the same courses in my graduate work. I really could not adapt it to my, to my beliefs. And I just could not get them to believe or understand that Knight had anything useful to say. I mean, Knight is considered the father of the Chicago School of Economics. Not an idea of Knight's is respected, or maybe there are some obscure ideas that are respected there. So I lived with this anxiety and tension for 23 years. The story did not, at the time I didn't think the story came to a good end, had come to a good end, but I found myself in 2000 on Morningside Heights. And then I started getting comfort. Now, let me say a few words about why comfort is important. So it sort of takes you to the idea of what a leap of faith is. A leap of faith is not blind faith. The knight of faith must have a full understanding of what the situation is before he or she makes a leap. I mean, otherwise, Abraham would have been simply chemically deranged, or but Abraham must have known that, had to know at some level that what he was doing was terribly, terribly wrong. Otherwise, there was no leap of faith. So there has to be knowledge. There has to, and out of this knowledge comes anxiety. And then what happens if it doesn't work out? I mean, taking a leap of faith is one thing. Keeping the faith is another. So what if Isaac had not been turned into a ram, and he might have been locked up in the psychiatric ward? But what if he hadn't been locked up in a psychiatric ward, and the next time God came to him and said, "I think that wife of yours, I think you should kill her too"? Would he really have done that? And sort of, I'd taken this leap of faith in this particular direction. It didn't work out. I needed comfort. And I got comfort from these gentlemen around here, from the Center of Capitalism and Society. And suddenly, I was talking to people who understood what I was saying, and who thought that the kinds of things that that night and were important, that specific facts, I mean, the world was not foreordained, that the entrepreneur could and had the responsibility for making decisions. And I said, oh my God, these people are way smarter than the people I used to encounter from the other side of the room, and they think the way I do. More importantly, it was not just that they had, by the process that I had, which was stumbling into this worldview by encounters, they were familiar with a body of knowledge and a scholarship which informed that worldview. And so all these things which were back at the which was in a hazy memory from Will Durant that I must have read when I was 19 years old, or something like that, started coming back. And there was sort of a pantheon of people whose philosophies and deep thoughts did inform the kind of Knightian view of the world, that I had. And in this pantheon were Nietzsche, and it was sort of, it was not everybody. It was Nietzsche, but not Kant, I believe. There was Hume. There were the pragmatists. I loved the pragmatists. I started reading the pragmatists and said, my God, it's sort of like Moliere's Gentilhomme, who's been speaking prose all his life and didn't know it. I'm a pragmatist. And then there's Kierkegaard. And so what are the connections? So Knight, for instance. And there's no reference to Kierkegaard in Knight, but many of the ideas are so congruent, it's uncanny. So I said Knight is dealing with situations where the past doesn't tell you much about the future. So it's the famous quote about living life forward and understanding it backward. In Knight, there is this mystery. How do people take decisions when the past is there, when neither math nor the past tells you what to do? And Knight says the ultimate logic or psychology of these deliberations is obscure, a part of the scientifically unfathomable mystery of life and mind. We must simply fall back upon the capacity of the intelligent animal to form more or less correct judgments and intuitive sense of values. And I mean, how close is this to a variety of quotes you can find in Kierkegaard about faith, about believing where reason takes you only so far, where the facts only take you so far. I could go on with my skepticism about the great abstractionists that I had encountered in 02138. I was in 02163. And 0214 as well, which is MIT. And Kierkegaard's views of the theologists of his time, people who simply bought into a program, did not think, had not had crises, and boy, does reading that give me comfort. So since I am maybe running out of time, I am. Or have I run out of time? Yes. I was just, no, let's just stop there then. Thank you.
Would you have found any use for any kind of macro aggregation studies of any of the stuff that we spend our time as economists looking at?
I've never taken a class in economics in my life.
So since net.
Did you believe in social science? Would you believe in social science? Any role?
So to the degree that I find resonances of the pragmatists in Kierkegaard, I would argue that at least William James's version of pragmatism would have had nothing to do with macroeconomics whatsoever, and the notion of abstracting without confronting specific multifarious situations. And I have to believe, from my thumbtack knowledge now of Kierkegaard, he too would not have been willing to make these grand, sweeping generalizations that macroeconomics necessarily entails.
I was very struck thinking about Edgeworth, the 19th century economist, had this whole notion of the hedonimeter. So the idea would be that every individual would wear some kind of device that would measure, probably a bit like up band, that would measure measure your state of utility or happiness at any given moment in time, and the government could therefore aggregate all those different indicators and set policy to sort of maximize the degree of utility in society. And I think to some extent today, with this sort of gross domestic happiness work we're looking at, that has a similar mindset. But I wonder, again, you know, I guess you could measure, he would have been open to people measuring their sense of I've made a good choice in some sense, but less any view that there was a common definition of happiness that made any sense. And probably some people say, you know, today Kierkegaard would have been medicated, and so that would have dealt with his anxiety with Prozac or whatever, and I guess that would have counted as positive happiness in a gross domestic happiness measure, which he would have profoundly disagreed with. But Amar, what do you think about some of those themes?
Build over my thumbtack knowledge of Kierkegaard. So.
Let's throw it open to the audience. Any responses to any of those thoughts before we go into other questions?
I like to think that Kierkegaard would have been on our side and would have said that the choices people make are revealed by what they do and not what they say they're going to do, they'd like to do. the side of economics in terms of revealed preferences, that they're actual choices, not what they say. But I also wanted to make a comment that we're going to, that all this has been recorded and it's going to be on the center's website. And I'm going to want to listen to the last few minutes that you said it first thing as soon as it comes up, because I'm sure many people will as well. It was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, on this, there are several issues. One, in the whole debate between Hegel or Hegelians and Kierkegaard, part of that issue was involved a certain kind of understanding of human being in terms of systems versus understanding of human beings in terms of individual choices. Now, there weren't necessarily the kinds of systems that we deal with now. But one of the ways in which that got framed was a distinction between quantitative and qualitative aspects of life. And at the heart of Hegelian analysis is an insistence that at a certain point, quantitative change can lead to incremental quantitative change can lead to a qualitative kind of change. Kierkegaard rejected that categorically. And his entire effort, I think, as several of people have talked earlier, was to try to bring to an awareness so that it can be enacted or performed a recognition of the non-quantifiable aspects of life upon which decision depends. The issue of happiness is also a complicated one, and this goes to a comment Ned made earlier in terms of flourishing. And what was it, exhilaration, or what was the Wayne? Wayne, what was that word? Because it was an important. Huh? Yeah, no, there's another word. No, there's another. Exhilaration. Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think Kierkegaard would be for exhilaration understood in a certain way, but that what he would understand by happiness or flourishing is not always exactly what is understood by happiness and flourishing. That the experience toward which he attempts the experience for which he attempts to provide the occasion is one in which there is genuine anxiety, uncertainty, terror, much closer to a sense of the sublime that does not satisfy and fulfill in any traditional way, but to the contrary, disrupts and dissatisfies. But that then is in a certain way the condition of the possibility of genuine creativity and not mimetic repetition, as you're supporting. And from his point of view, the quantitative would involve that which is subjected, can be analyzed quantitatively, would be the repetitious and not the qualitative, which is always the gap the gap that no system can encompass, and the void, which is the only place where there is genuine acceleration. I'll pull an Abby here. I don't know enough about that. Huh? What? Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
In order to measure happiness, you need a theory of human nature in which to measure it against. And he was not a systematizer, so in that sense, that's why I think he's one of us.
Any decision that is genuinely momentous for Kierkegaard, I mean, especially, again, I'm thinking of Fear and Trembling, thinking of Abraham, are choices that you cannot think yourself into on someone else's behalf. So I wonder if, I mean, does that speak at all to that question for you?
So this is what I was going to say before Matthew rudely stopped me. No, appropriately put me in my place. The one thing which bothers me about the whole enterprise, and the one thing, sorry, what? So my enterprise, or the Center on Capitalism and Society enterprise, and this notion of exhilaration and so forth. I do come from a somewhat different religious tradition, and my views have been molded by Vedantism and the end of the Vedas, where one aspires to be neither happy nor unhappy. Where one, I mean, yes, sort of free will creates anxiety, but can you then not, through free will, transcend your own anxiety and will yourself into this into the state of nishkama karma or sthita prajna or equanimity? And where does happiness as a concept, or even preferences as a concept, come into this this belief of being above it all? So,
yeah.
Thanks. I think Kierkegaard at one level would be really interested in the kind of research you're doing that sort of charts people's happiness, but he wouldn't think that that was indicative of the fact that they were really happy, or that was any sign that human beings are happy doing that. It would just be a reflection of the fact that this group of people at this group of time came to believe that making these choices would make them happy. I think in general, he wanted to call attention to the individual, as sort of Mark was saying, but to resist, and as Wayne was saying earlier also, any kind, he wanted to create the individual as a site of resistance to the kind of forces he saw working in society that would cause people to believe that something other than what would make them happy would actually make them happy. So the individual as a site of resistance, and an idea that we haven't really gotten to today is, for him, what was crucial to having an individual become a site of resistance was obedience. Obedience to God. Right? That, for Kierkegaard, was the way that you find a point of freedom, which is complicated and controversial, and we can talk about it.
And it does seem to, I mean, one of the things that this happiness study comes out of is an attempt to try and do better policy making than the kind that had economics being just about economic growth. And I guess what you're saying is that there's really nothing to measure that would actually tell us whether, except unless we can measure the mind of God, that we're not really going to be able to get anywhere useful out of statistics at all in terms of our overall progress as a society.
Yeah, hello, my name is Sanjay Peters. I'm an economist by training, and I'm currently here just as a researcher at the Committee for Global Thought at Columbia. I had a question regarding this whole notion of our ability to make rational choices, and whether the new technologies that we're, take for granted today, these things as Facebook, Twitter, etc., and whether to some extent that really restricts our levels. I mean, Mike gives the sense we have choices to get new gadgets to make our life simpler, but at the end of the day, whether that restricts our own liberties, and in itself then undermines our sense of making intelligent choices. One new technology is this new Google Glass. So to some extent, people think, well, I don't have to pull out my iPhone and use the maps, and it'll prevent me from getting run over by a car as I'm crossing the street trying to figure out the street address. But on the other hand, all the data that you have on your Google Glass, hackers can actually access that and know absolutely everything that you're doing. The kind of combination to enter a house, what you're writing on a notepad, all these types of things, to some extent, might impinge upon our personal liberties. So I wonder to what extent, I mean, my understanding and knowledge of Kierkegaard is pedestrian, somewhat like the first speaker's knowledge of economics. So I can't say to what extent, we can argue that because he had these notions of having multiple identities, I think he'd be more paranoid and not necessarily be willing to disclose information about who he is, even under a pseudonym, because the current society we live in gives us a sense of immense options that we associate with a better quality of life, modernity, etc. But the larger scheme of things, I think it reduces choice and freedom.
Great. Amar, do you want to take the first shot at that one?
So the first shot is you have a choice of whether you have a Twitter account or not. And I've chosen not to have a Twitter account, so I have no idea of much of what you're talking about, so I'll pass it on.
Well, I mean, I only have 140 Twitter followers, so I don't really know that much about it. But I mean, do we have a choice to have those? That's not a rhetorical question.
Do we think rational choice models, which are at the heart of most of modern economics, really have any validity?
That's a different question.
Well, let's see. I mean, this was at the heart of what you were.
Yeah, we could decide that first, and then.
It's the whole thing of wasted. Right. You know, the Chicago School is famously associated with the rational choice models and bringing people up to believe they can make rational decisions.
So there I will assert that rational choice models are not about choice at all. They are about, they're about describing a computer program that has data fed into it in a pre-organized way. And it's only about predicting or trying to analyze the structure of, so there is no choice in rational choice in my view. At least choice the way I understand it.
But do you think the Chicago School is something that actually their model of human behavior is actually
It's not a model of human behavior. No, it's quite literally not a model of.
They make some assumptions about how people behave and then build policy on those assumptions.
So it is quite literally not a policy about humans. It's a policy. It's a model of highly abstracted input-output models, which I would not confuse with humans.
Yeah, one they felt would go off to Latin America and impose
Right.
Yeah. One last question.
I wonder about this reduction of, especially in the context of thinking about Kierkegaard, of this reduction of the question of freedom to the question of choice. Especially because I was thinking about the end of Abby's talk, and where she started to sort of get into, from the sort of consumer angle, and I do feel comfortable actually switching between the social scientific and the philosophical. From the consumer angle, of course, one of the things revealed in the Kim Kierkegaard Twitter account that is actually sort of philosophically apropos is that Kim Kardashian, it's really hard to get out of this little loop, actually reveals the sort of forced choice that Mark was referring to before in consumerism. But that even is still on the forced choice side of the consumer. There's also, of course, the forced choice side of the worker. We're all not in a condition of perfect autonomous freedom. We may want to be in a condition of perfect autonomous freedom, but of course this is entirely what is prevented in a modeling system like the Chicago School of Economics, which assumes something quite different. It assumes an identity between freedom and choice. Also, just this one final comment, the notion of comfort in decision, or Kierkegaard as providing comfort in decision, I find that incredibly troubling, just both in sort of just thinking about the history of decision in especially juridical thought, but also just because it seems like Kierkegaard wants us to be incredibly discomfited, if you will, in making decisions. That's the whole point. It's fear and trembling.
Great. And I wonder, does Herbert Simon's model of bounded rationality, is that the closest that we might have to a sort of Kierkegaardian view of freedom and in the choices we make?
Can I? Yeah. So first of all, one of the things I was going to say is that Kierkegaard would be probably rolling over in his grave that he serves as Valium for anyone. But I am allowed to confront Kierkegaard the way I wish. That is my freedom. And if I find him comforting, too bad for Soren. Right. And I think I'll go back a little bit to the. I'm sorry, I dismissed your question a little bit. I was hoping that Abby would. pick it up. But on right, okay. So, just as an empirical matter, sort of practical freedom. This is the paradox, I think, of modern life, which is that Robinson Crusoe lives in a libertarian paradise where all he can do is to knock coconuts off trees. We now live in an era, and I think this is factually true, where more of us have more of an opportunity, and indeed the requirement, to exercise our initiative and judgment than was the case 50 or 100 years ago. I mean, go back to Harvard Business Review articles in the 1920s or thereabouts, and they're all about control. Read those same articles now, and they're all about empowerment. So the idea is that this society, at least possibly purely for instrumental reasons, is being constructed where everyone is supposed to do his or her own thing in his or her own way, otherwise you starve. At the same time, this opportunity to have much more choice is constrained in a manner which Robinson Crusoe isn't constrained. So there are like a zillion rules. Some of these rules are imposed to protect our privacy, when as well they should. But I think, practically speaking, there's way more choice now. Perhaps too much, perhaps too little, but a great deal more choice. I think so.
A last word to you, on anything.
I don't think it is.
Say a bit more? No. Okay. Well, and you might be interested that on the Monty Python lyrics front, Clive Crook, who's an economics journalist who's often at these events, has come up with sodden Kierkegaard, when he'd had a few, could bore you senseless about what is true. I think on that note, I'd like to thank the panel for a very stimulating conversation and go to lunch.